We are now in a crisis. The day of the Lord is approaching at blinding speed. Okay? And we are living at the climax of God's 6,000-year plan. We've been called to the special work of regaining the dominion of this earth. We talked about that the first night. That's a special task that we've been called to. And so, this study is on the chronology, showing how chronology and prophecy forecast Earth's final events between 2020 and 2027. And as I said once already, if you would have told me 25 years ago that I'd be standing up here and sharing this, I would have just laughed and never would have believed you. But the Lord had different ideas, and we go with what He. So we just jump right into it here, and this study is in 4 parts. I'm hoping that we do 2 of them tonight and 2 of them tomorrow night. That's about an hour and 15 minutes to do 2 each night. Hour and 15 minutes one night. Now it might be an hour and a half, but around that amount of time. The first 2 parts are on Bible chronology. We're going to start in Genesis, and we're going to go through the Bible chronology to establish the chronologic timeline. Then tomorrow night, by God's grace, we're going to then go through and look at the Jubilee connections that tie those chronologic figures together. We all know that the Jubilee is and we understand this from surveying too. That was my field that the Lord put me in. And you have these records, you have the records, you do the research on the records, and you go out and you gather the information, but the records say it's this far. Well, that's what the Jubilees do for us, because we have all these chronological figures going through history that the prophets have given us, but the Jubilees are checkpoints. And the interesting thing about Jubilees is they're exact, because they go from Day of Atonement to 50 years later, the Day of Atonement. So, anyway, we'll be covering that part tomorrow night. So, I just wanted to say real quick before we started about the counting back. In Daniel, it says, in other words, I want to say why we're studying, why we want to know when the end point is. Okay, there's a reason why we're working toward this end point. Because in Daniel, the question that Daniel asked Yeshua was what? How long to the end? That's right. So the end point, so he gave him an amount of time to the end and deliverance of God's people. So in God's wisdom, because he didn't want people 176 years ago to know that time was going to go on another 176 years, time prophecy ended at that point, and there was no ability to trace prophetic time forward after that point. But that's not a problem when you understand that what was actually given us in those prophecies is the amount of time to the end. So it was only for the last generation to know where these prophetic times would fit in. And so the question again in Daniel was, how long is it to the end? So if we can, it's the only connect point that's been given us in Daniel chapter 12, the end. And so that's why we're searching for the end. Because if we can know where the end is and the amount of time that Yeshua gave Daniel that it was going to be to the end, then we can know when the prophecies began. So we'll just jump right in to the study of the chronology. We already looked at that scripture. This is from the Pioneers. It's a long statement, so I paraphrased it, but it's accurate. The Bible has given the data for a complete system of chronology extending from creation to the Persian Empire. From this time forward, we have an accurate historic record of secular time, Ptolemy's canon. At the point where inspired chronology leaves us, this canon of unquestionable accuracy commences, and thus all of world history is spanned. That was what our pioneers taught. So, and here's a statement from education. The history which the great I Am has marked out in his word, uniting link after link in the prophetic chain from eternity in the past to eternity in the future, that'll keep us busy studying for a while, tells us where we are today in the procession of the ages and what may be expected in the time to come. That's a promise. And then this question, Review and Herald, March 22, shall we not search the Scriptures that we may know where we are in this world's history? Now, I want to say with that God doesn't ask us to search for things that we can't find. It's that simple. And so that's a beautiful statement to enter into this study. So that's what we're going to do. We are going to search the Scriptures to find out where we are in this earth's history. So, part one is we're going to study from creation to when Manasseh was taken captive. Okay? And in section 1, and that involves 6 periods. It involves the period from the creation to the flood, from the flood to Abraham beginning his sojourn, and that is called the Exode. It's different than the Exodus. So if you're reading in a history book and it talks about the Exode, that's talking about the sojourn of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay? So, and then we're going to study the period of the Exode, or from when Abraham begins his sojourn to the Exodus out of Egypt, and then from the Exodus to the beginning of Solomon's reign, and from the beginning of Solomon's reign to the divided kingdom, and then from the divided kingdom to the time when Manasseh was taken captive. So I know it sounds like a lot, but really, some of the periods are pretty simple. And so, period number 1 is from creation to the flood. And it's pretty straightforward. I think probably most of the people that have been interested in chronology have done this work at some point or another. I know I've talked to some here that have. And you're going to notice, I'm going to just mention this right off the bat. You're going to see that, you see that 1656 year sum there at the end? It says 657 in the book. So that has been revised. And I just want to say that. It makes no difference in the outcome of the end date because of, and you'll see why by the time we get done, but it makes no difference in the outcome. But the reason that changed is because whenever the Bible refers to the flood, it refers to when the flood began. The point of the flood is when that water came. And that's the point that everybody is referring to. And you can, if you study that period of the Scripture closely, that's what you'll find out. Anyway, these periods are very simple to add up in your own time. Genesis 5 is where you find each one of them, except the 600 years of Noah, and you find it in Genesis 7:6. Now, how do we know that these periods come from creation? Well, at the beginning of Genesis 5, you see Genesis 5 is where all those come from. At the beginning of Genesis 5, it says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam in the day that God created man." And notice he's going to say it 3 times. In the likeness of God made he him, there's another one, male and female created he them and blessed them and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. You think he didn't want us to miss it? And yet there are still people today teaching that these periods start when sin entered the world. And I have sit and labored at times, and, I'm not condemning anybody. I'm just saying it seems real clear that these periods start at creation. So we're going from creation here with those numbers. So it's entered 1,656 years into that first period. Now we're going to do from the flood to Abraham's sojourn. And it's simply taken from Genesis 11. And just as an example, from the flood to Arphaxad being born to Shem is 2 years. That's Genesis 11:10, and then it gives the rest of the amounts of time until Terah's death. Okay, Terah lived 205 years. If you look at Acts 7:4, you'll find out that Terah, that Abraham left Haran when Stephen, as he was given that dissertation and the heavens opened, is the one that gave us that information that Abraham entered the promised land at the time of his father's death. It's also in Genesis 12. But if you add those figures up, and you can do that in your own time, 427 years. And here are the verses. Abraham dwelt in Haran, and from thence, when his father was dead, he removed him into this land wherein ye now dwell. In other words, Abraham began his sojourn. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. This is Genesis, so it says the same thing. Abram departed, began his sojourn, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and into the land of Canaan they came. So we'll enter that period, the 427 years. These are just straight Bible numbers. These aren't, there's no twisting of the figures and so period 3 is one of the most misunderstood and complicated periods. 4, 5, and then 6 will be a little bit, take a little bit more work too, but we'll just tear into number 3 here and the sojourn of Abraham. Now, here's what it says in Exodus 12, 40 and 41. It says, now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the, by the way, that's a definite time there. Even the self-same day, it came to pass that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. Now, when you look at that at first, you would think possibly that they were in Egypt for 430 years. But that's not what the text is teaching. The sojourning of means the sojourn that they were part of. The sojourn that the children of Israel were part of was 430 years. And we're going to see this because Paul understood it, because he was a scholar of the Old Testament scriptures. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith, he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, and the heirs with him of the same promise. So not only were they the heirs of the promise, they were heirs of the same sojourn as well, and we're going to find that out here as we go along. That's Hebrews 11. But Paul understood this, and by the way, Abraham, it says, if you look at the chronology, we'll look at it in a minute, that Abraham did not die until Jacob was 15 years old. So they indeed, I mean, Paul was immersed in this to be able to even write that information. And but here's where he says it. Now to Abraham, you see that? And his seed, which ultimately is Christ, were the promises made. And this I say, that the covenant, that was the promise to Abraham and his seed, that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law, which was 430 years after, cannot disannul. You see that? That the covenant made to Abraham was 430 years. When that covenant was fulfilled, when that promise was fulfilled, they came out of Egypt 430 years later, because the giving of the law was within 3 months of the time of the Exodus, if you do the research on the chronology. So from the time they left was 400. From the time Abraham, well, we'll just look at the next slide. And let me just say this. The covenant was not, that 430 years did not begin until Abraham obeyed God. And as soon as Abraham, at his father's death, went into, because he said, this was what God said, you do this, and I'll do this. And he said, get thee up and do what? Leave your father's house, and I will do this. And so not until the actual death of Terah did that covenant begin, the clock began on that covenant. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now the Lord had said to Abraham, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee. There was the conditional promise that when he left, that he would begin to receive the promise. And make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing, and thee all families, shall all families of the earth be blessed. Now, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him, and Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. So he makes it very clear that this is when they entered Canaan. Okay, this is when the sojourn began. And now we're going to see that it's impossible that the 430 years was the amount of time the children of Israel were in Egypt. I think if I put that slide, oh yeah, I did. Boy, am I so glad. This slide does a couple things. It's going to help us. One thing it's going to do is help you see that we didn't just throw these figures together, but that we studied the Bible to make sure. So here's a general overview of the 430 years, and it's really special because I'm just going to read here for a minute. Abraham was 75. You watch the chart while I'm reading. Abraham was 75 when he left Haran, in obedience to God, began his sojourn in the promised land. That's Genesis 12:4. Okay, that's right at the beginning. He was 100 when Isaac was born. So that would be 25 years later, right? Okay. That's 25 years after leaving Haran. That's Genesis 21:5. Isaac was married at 40 years old. That's Genesis 25:20. Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob was born. That would be 20 years after he was married. Okay, Genesis 25:26. You see how these numbers aren't just meaningless numbers in the Bible, that God put them in there for a reason. Jacob was 130 years old when he went down into Egypt, Genesis 47, 28 through 31. It's of interest that Abraham was I already said that. got ahead of my notes, which is good. I like it when I don't even need them. Paul said he dwelt in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob. He was 15 years old when Abraham died. At any rate, this makes a total of how many years from Abraham leaving Haran, Terah's death, to Jacob and his sons going into Egypt? 215 years. I mean, it's just simple Bible figures. Now, you may remember that God had said to Abraham, you remember the smoking furnace and the vision that Abraham had? He said that his posterity would be strangers in a strange land for how long? 400 years. Because the beginning of this point comes 30 years later with Isaac. But in the fourth generation, they shall come hither again. Okay, that was going to be the Exodus. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full, Genesis 15:16. So Genesis 46 tells us that when Jacob went down to Egypt, so he was the seed that went down in, okay, that only Reuben, Simeon, and Levi had children. By examining the chronology of Levi, we will be able to show clearly evidence that neither the 400-year period or the 430-year chronologic period begins when Jacob went down into Egypt. And so here's the scripture. And these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt, Jacob and his sons, one of which was Levi, and the sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. We're going to follow Kohath. That's Genesis 46, 8 through 11. So Jacob, his son Levi, and Levi's son Kohath were the ones that were alive when Jacob went down into Egypt at 130 years old. Okay, that's Genesis 47, 28 through 31. Further chronology in Exodus chapter 6 gives us the line of Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Aaron. And so, remember, Jacob was the seed that went down in, but in the fourth generation they would come out. And that's Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Aaron. Okay, so when we look at their... this is one of the most complex slides that I put in this study because, but I wanted us to understand that I wanted you to understand that it's not like we didn't, go a little deeper and study out the details. So Jacob was the seed of Abraham that went into Egypt. So here's the chronology from Exodus 6, 16 through 20. Kohath lived to be 133 years old, and he died. Amram, his son, lived 137 years, and he died. And we know Moses was 80 and Aaron was 83 when they left Egypt, Exodus 7:7. So we also know that Levi and Kohath were the ones that were alive when he went into Jacob again. Genesis 46, 8 through 11. So if you add the full length, even if you took, we know that Kohath was alive when they went down into Egypt. If you add the full length of his life and the full length of Amram's life and the full length of Aaron's life until the Exodus, you can't even come up with 400 years. So back to the original point when it said that now the sojourn of the children of Israel, which dwelt in Egypt, was 430 years. It meant the sojourn that they were part of, and Paul pointed that out to us in two different ways, that the 430 years began with the sojourn of Abraham and ended the selfsame day when they came out. And so... But there's another neat fact here. You see that 400 years going back at the bottom of the chart there? That falls when Isaac was 5. You remember what happened? when Isaac was 5? Well, yeah, but his father made a feast. Okay? And if you go to Sister White's writings, she doesn't say the self-same day on the 430 years. She says that it was the self-same day 400 years later also. So what day did they come out of Egypt on? Okay. So what would have 400 years earlier been on the self-same day? So what was the feast that Abraham had when Isaac was 5 and was weaned? And by the way, that is the beginning of the sojourn of the seed of Abraham, because when you were 5, if you go to the Mosaic Law, you find out that at 5 years old is the age change between being nursed and being like Benjamin and Tristan, and you're out there on your own feet, with the rest of the party. Isaac, yeah. So it's very interesting to understand that particular point. So it's just another verification that it was a feast at that time. So anyway, we'll enter that in 430 years. I could have put some spirit of prophecy statements in here, but the Bible has plenty of evidence. We don't. So period number 4, this one's simple. From the Exodus from Egypt into Solomon's reign. And it came to pass 480th year. Isn't this nice how God did this for us? The 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. So the beginning of Solomon's, if his 4th year was 480 years in, when would his first year be? Yeah, that's right. 480 minus 4 is 476. So from the time of the Exodus to the beginning of Solomon's reign is 476 years. Very simple. And that's a little more detailed. It gives the months, but it's the same thing. And so we enter it in and keep moving here because I really like to get both of these. Solomon's reign to the divided kingdom. This is another very simple period, period number 5. It's just simply, the Bible says, in the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Okay, and Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son. Now, Rehoboam was the beginning of the line of the kings of Judah, right? And Jeroboam began to reign with the 10 tribes. And by the way, there is not one king of that whole time that it does not say, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Not one. Only, there's not one king of Israel from the time of Jeroboam on that I could find. So we follow the kings of Judah for 2 reasons. I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll talk about that later. So we enter the 40 years. So we're down to period number 6, and that's from the divided kingdom to Manasseh being taken captive. I guess we're going to get into it right away here. From the divided kingdom to the captivity of Manasseh. And there are the kings of Judah. And the reason we use the kings of Judah is for 2 reasons. One is that they're given with the same identical figures in the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles. So you have 2 witnesses to those numbers. Those particular references I put there are from the book of Kings. And the other reason that we use the kings of Judah is because they stretch farther. Because Israel was, Samaria fell in the 6th year of Hezekiah. And so that's another reason why we use these kings instead of the kings of Israel. But if you add up just the simple figures there. For the kings of Judah to the time of Manasseh's 20th year, it comes up to 314 years. Now, there is one, you see that spot that says vacancy? There is one spot we should look at here in this line. And there are the scriptures for that spot, so you can always stop the recording if you want to look at it more. But and here's the reason. It says Amaziah lived 15 years after the death of Jehoash, king of Israel. Well, Amaziah was Uzziah's father that reigned on the other side of that 11-year gap. But he reigned 15 years after Jehoash, king of Israel, began his reign, or after his death, and Jeroboam II began his reign. But 2 Kings 15:1 tells us that the first year of Uzziah commences with the 27th year of Jeroboam. That left an 11-year gap between his father Amaziah and King Uzziah. But if you go a little further, you find out that when he began to reign, he was 16 years old. So how old would have he been when his father died? 5. So that explains the vacancy, because he was only 5. And they had what they called, I don't know if I'm going to be able to remember the word, but they had a word for that anyway. When they had overseers over the king until he got old enough to reign. What? Yeah, that's it. Who said that? Thank you. Yes. At the end, yeah. But you won't forget, will you? Good. Okay. Yeah. So, anyway, that's the 11-year vacancy according to the kings of Judah. And I did not discover that. It's in William Miller's book. So, they were on it. They understood. So with that 11-year vacancy and giving 20 years to Manasseh until he was taken captivity is 314 years. And so we're going to enter that. Oh no, we're going to look at the missing number of Bible chronology first. Now we run into this when we're surveying. It's like here's how it works. You go, okay, there's one missing number can make everything look really funny and bad. But you just have to keep going, gather all the information you can, and keep going, keep pushing forward, and eventually it becomes clear what it is that makes everything fit, you might say. Okay, so we're going to call this the missing number of Bible chronology. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years, what's it say? In Jerusalem, 2 Chronicles 33:1. Now, and the Lord spake to Manasseh and to his people, but they would not hearken. Wherefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the host of the king of Assyria, which took Manasseh, that was Esarhaddon, among the thorns, and bound him with fetters, and carried him captive to Babylon. So he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. Okay? But, so here's a period of time when he wasn't in Jerusalem. Carried him captive to Babylon, and when he was in affliction, he besought the Lord his God, and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers, and prayed unto him, and he was entreated of him, and heard his supplication, and brought him again to Jerusalem into his kingdom or reign. So then he was reigning in Jerusalem again. The Bible is very specific there. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord, he was God. Now, a lot of times when we read the Bible, we think, okay, it said that he went into captivity and he repented and he came back, and it's like he went into captivity one day and he repented the next, and the third day he was back in his kingdom. But that's not how it works. Sometimes it takes a while, and if you read the history of Manasseh, he fell into quite a bit of wickedness. And sometimes, the devil doesn't always let go that easy, but I imagine it took him a little bit of time to come to grips. And we're going to see that it did. But, so here's another scripture that makes that point, that if a king if he was taken captive to another country, that it wasn't considered part of his reign. It says Jehoiakim was 23 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. You see that? In Jerusalem. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that the fathers had done. And Pharaoh Necho put him in bands at Riblah in the land of Hamath, and that he might not reign in Jerusalem, and put the land to tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. So the point is that if you're not in Jerusalem, you're not reigning in Jerusalem. Okay? So that is the missing number in Bible chronology, is the amount of time that Manasseh was in captivity. So you'll see that we have there the 20 years until he was taken into captivity. But I want you to notice something here. We're going to solve for the gap later. That's just how it is. You just keep moving and gather everything you can. We're going to solve for the gap later. But it would not matter if it was 15 and 40, or if it was 25 and 30 on the other side. When we're all said and done, it would not change the chronological history of the world at all. But just based on comfort, we're going to go ahead and decide, when he was taken captive. The pioneers studied this part here diligently. Isaiah gave a 65-year prophecy that places the captivity of Manasseh at or near the 20th year of his reign. It says in Isaiah 7, 8, and 9 that in the first of Ahaz, that this prophecy came from Isaiah in the first of Ahaz, which for the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years, or 65 years, shall Ephraim be broken, that it shall not be a people, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria. He was talking about the fall of Samaria. Well, we're going to find out, interestingly enough, that at the time that Samaria fell is not when they fell, but when they went back in later to the complete decimation of the 10 tribes, 65 years later, right, according to Isaiah's prophecy, is when Manasseh was taken captive in the thorns. So 294, I think I took those 3 slides out. We can look at them tomorrow night if you want to. I'll look, but I think I took them out, because this could go on a long time. But if anybody has a question on that, we can talk about it more. But in Sylvester Bliss's book, he goes through that 65 years and explains that Manasseh was taken captive at that time. So we have in our list of kings 294 years up to when Manasseh began to reign, and then the 20 years that we're going to give him before the gap. And again, as I say, it is immaterial whether you use 15 and 40 or 20 and 35. It's still going to end up whatever the gap is plus 55. So it's a total of 314 years up until the 294 plus 20. It's 314 years until he was taken captive. We're going to do part 2. We want to finish the chronology tonight. There's the review of what we did in part 1. The 1,656 years are straight Bible figures. The 427 years were straight Bible figures. The 430 years is a straight Bible figure. The 476 years from 1 Kings 6:1. By the way, if somebody had asked me this question, the reason that the pioneers came up with a different chronologic history of the world is because they used 450 years for the kings of, for the judges, for the period of the judges, and they threw out 1 Kings 6:1 because they just couldn't rectify the two with each other. And it was using 450 years for the period of the judges is why they were able to think it was so much earlier than what it is in reality. And then the 40 years of Solomon, and then the period of the kings there to Manasseh's 20th year. So section 2 is going to go from Manasseh's reinstatement to the year 2020. And except you see period 7 there where he was in captivity is still a question. So we'll go from his reinstatement to the restoration of, from his reinstatement to the first captivity of Judah. This one's also fairly simple. Period number 8. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes. So that was when Daniel, that's Daniel 1 through 3. So Daniel 1 tells us that the first captivity, Daniel's captivity, took place in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim. Okay? So we want to go then from when Manasseh was reinstated, his 35 years that we're going to keep track of, until the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, because that's our period from the restoration of Manasseh to the first captivity of Judah. So Manasseh, we're going to give him his other 35 years to make sure we didn't drop anything there. And Ammon reigned 2 years, 2 Kings 21:19. Josiah reigned 31 years, 2 Kings 22:1. Jehoahaz reigned 0.25, 2 Kings 23, and Jehoiakim 3 years into his reign from Daniel 1 through 6. So we add those figures, 35 plus 2 plus 31 plus 3 comes up at 71 years. And so from the restoration of Manasseh to the first captivity is 71 years. So we'll enter that. Now, the next period is pretty simple as far as the number is concerned. And yeah, that's it. From the beginning of the 70-year captivity in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim to the end of the 70-year captivity, which was at the decree of Cyrus, is 70 years. You know, it is kind of funny, but it's also very difficult period, and there's a lot of controversy over this period. Yes. The 0.25 years, I used the point. Let's go back to that. It was in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, so I just decided, okay, that since it was not completely through his 3rd year, I just put that 0.25 to bring to a full 3 years to use for Jehoiakim. Technically, in a math standpoint, that puts you pretty close, on the average to which, the 1 year or the other year. But what we're going to see, and, we do this in surveying all the time, you get all these figures, and, it's supposed to be 100 feet, and you go out and measure, and it's 99.7. And the next lot over is supposed to be 100 feet, and it's, a lot of times, if this one's 99.7, this one's 100.3. Right. And so you have the figures, but what we're going to find out is that those exact 50-year increments are going to verify and justify any slight couple months that might exist. That is the beauty of why. I mean, God wanted this to be so simple that anybody could follow it and understand that those 50-year increments are what is going to nail it for us. So that's my answer to that question. So the first captivity of Judah to the decree of Cyrus. Therefore Jehovah brought upon them Judah, the king of the Chaldees, and them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon until they were servants to him and his sons. Until when? It was the first year of Cyrus, and it was in the spring, and it was in the beginning of his reign that 70 years ended. And that was to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. We're going to see in this study, before we get through it, how important those Sabbaths are to the Lord. They're very important. And for as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill, how long? 70 years. Now, I just want to take just a minute to say that as I was studying this chronology, if you, Brother Harold and I both have amazing discoveries on this period. I really appreciated listening to what he had to say the other day, but I'm going to share with you what my experience was, and that is that if you go back in the chronology and you take Ezekiel's prophecy, remember Ezekiel laid on his side for 390 days for who? The 10 tribes. And then he laid on his other side for 40 days for Judah. And he did that for a very important reason. Israel, everybody knew that from the time, Israel existed, from the very beginning. From the time that they said, give us a king, until the fall of Samaria was... How long do you think? 390 years. So when he was laying on that one side, prophesying to Judah about remember he had the siege in front of him? Everybody knew what it meant, because they all knew that Israel had only lasted 390 years, and they knew what had happened to the 10 tribes. And so Judah, the prophecy was that he was giving was that Judah was going to fall in 40 years. And so the neat part about that is if you go back and you take those two periods, the 390 for the 10 tribes and the 40 for Judah, and you count up all the sabbatical and Jubilee years in that 390 years and in that 40 years, how many sabbaticals and Jubilees do you think there are? You got it. There are exactly 70 land Sabbath years and Jubilee years, all added together in those two periods. And those in themselves are a chronological gauge, because if you move that chronology a few years one direction, it doesn't come out at 70. But it does come out at 70 when you have the correct chronology. So that was a great revelation. So when I look and I see, and Daniel understood by books the number of years, I go, I think I'm treading on sacred ground here, because it's really been a blessing, and the Lord has really been kind. So, to fulfill 70 years. So the land was going to rest for every one of those years that they did not let the land rest. And so the period began when Babylon began to take control. Because remember, he said, I will bring from the north, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land, and this whole land shall be a desolation and astonishment, and these nations shall serve who? King of Babylon. So when the king of Babylon began to take rule over Pharaoh Necho, which was at the captivity of Daniel, the first captivity, that's when the 70 years started. Some people say, well, no, it started at the second captivity or the third captivity. It started at the first captivity. And we're going to see that from a couple standpoints. Because the 70-year part's easy, but there's a lot of argumentation on where that 70 years begins. So, but one of the most significant, and Daniel was studying this because he wanted to know exactly when it was going to happen. And by the way, just because the Lord said it was going to happen, he just didn't do it. He prayed. And that's what we need to do, is pray. So, now these are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem unto the residue of the elders which were carried away captives, and to priests and prophets, and to who? All the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried away captive. Did that include Daniel in the first captivity? Okay, so he's making this promise. That's the important part. He's making this promise to all of them. And he said, thus saith the Lord, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you. So that promise was to everybody from the first captivity and on. Important scriptures. And we know it ended in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, from 2 Chronicles 36, 22, and 23. Within about 2 years this is from Prophets and Kings, within about 2 years from the fall of Babylon, Cyrus succeeded to the throne. Remember, Babylon fell in 538, and we're going to see that Cyrus began to reign in 536, 2 years later. And the beginning of his reign marked the completion of the 70 years since the first company of Hebrews had been taken by Nebuchadnezzar from their Judean home. So she sweeps the whole subject right there in a couple sentences, that the 70 years was from the first captivity. So, but the Bible showed us the same thing. The promise was to all. Conclusion, the 70-year prophecy given by Jeremiah began with Judah's first captivity in the third year of Jehoiakim and ended with the decree of Cyrus in his first year. So we'll put it in there. And so now, the Lord connecting Bible chronology to secular time of the present day. Let's just think from common sense for a minute. The Lord would not give us all these numbers and bring us all down through history and then drop us. So obviously, his chronology, because it has a point where it stops, he deemed secular time strong enough to be able to be discerned by his people to pick up and take us on. Because remember, the statement we read said that from the history of the world, the entire history of the world. And so we're going to connect to secular time here, but we're going to do it using the Bible and secular time and matching up some points. Oh, here's the statement I was talking about. The Bible gives the data for a complete, this is from the pioneers in the 1842 to 1844 movement. The Bible gives the chronology for a complete system, the data for a complete system of chronology extending from creation to the birth of Cyrus a clearly ascertained date. From this period downward, we have the undisputed canon of Ptolemy. At the point where inspired chronology leaves us, this canon of undoubted accuracy commences, and thus the whole arch is spanned. Now, 457 is based on this canon. This canon, by the way, was established by using 20 or so eclipses. In other words, they were connecting, and eclipses, an eclipse, it's like what scientists nowadays will tell us exactly what minute and second an eclipse is going to happen in the future. They can also tell us within a minute and a second, from astronomy when an eclipse happened, 2,000 years ago. So that's what this canon is based on, because Ptolemy was taking the history and connecting it with eclipses, over 20 eclipses, and that's how he established this chronology, and it's the chronology that our pioneers used. Say again? Oh, good question. I think it's in Sylvester Bliss, but I'll get it for you. Thank you. I'll revise that. I'll put the actual place of quote up there. I'll dig it out too for you, Judith. Thank you. Thought I had most of them on there. Oh, it goes on here. And the accuracy of, I already said this. And the accuracy of the canon is demonstrated by the concurrent agreement of more than 20 eclipses. To unsettle Ptolemy's work would unsettle every chronologic date, so that chronology would be of no more value than mere guesswork. So, and here's a list of dates based on Ptolemy's canon, and that requires some study. But the most important date there, and I have it in bold, is 536, because that is the one that where we ended up with our Bible chronology was at the release of the captives in the first year of Cyrus. But nonetheless, we'll make some connect points here with the Bible. You see there, the canon says, my pointer's not, it won't work on that screen, but you see about 2/3 of the way through, it says the first year of evil Merodach was in the 37th year of Jehoiakim's captivity, 2 Kings 25:27. And you count back that 37 years when he and Ezekiel were taken captive at the same time. And then you count back the years of Jehoiakim to Nebuchadnezzar's first year, which was in Nebuchadnezzar's first year of his sole reign without his father, which was in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. Or you can go back to when Daniel was taken captive at the 3rd year. We used full 3 years for that captivity. Those figures all add up and match the 606 BC and 605 BC date from the canon. And it's the same way from 536. If you go back, that's on the canon, and you go back 70 years, it matches the 606 date. So, and the 457 date I consider an anchor point, because we're told that date is unimpeachable. So, but there it is from the Bible, the connections that God gave us to secular time from Bible time. And as I said, Bible time went to a certain point when he felt like, God's people had a hold of it, so his people. So I'm going to put that 536 years in there. That would be, 536 BC. By the way, the fall of Babylon was in 538. 2 years later, Cyrus took the throne. You can find it in just about any history book or anywhere you want to look, except on internet, because it's been terribly corrupted on internet. And you can find that. And also, but that 538 date of the fall of Babylon, you can find it in the Bible commentaries for the Baptists, for the Adventists. You can find it in secular dictionaries. You can find it in a lot of the historians like John Usher, and there's two other, Xenophon, and there's one other fellow, I can't remember his name right now. It's just everywhere. 538 is a strongly established date, and the 536. And so the Lord left the chronology off at exactly the point where he knew that we would need to pick it up. So 536 was the year of the captivity, of the release of the exiles. And so from 536 BC to the date line is how many years? 536. Right? Okay? And from the BC AD date line to 2020 is 2020. So that part's fairly simple once we know where we're at in the secular time. And so essentially what we have is a chronology from creation to the year 2020 with one period, the period of Manasseh's captivity, that we don't have established yet. So there's the summary of tonight. The period from around the flood up to the flood, the 427 years up until Abraham's sojourn, from the flood to Abraham's sojourn, the 430-year sojourn, 1 Kings 6:1, that 476 years, Solomon's reign, the period of the kings, clear 71 years from the period of the kings after the gap, the 70-year captivity, and 536 and 2020. So at this point, until tomorrow, we will not be able, because tomorrow we're going to find the Jubilees. And you know, this in itself is really important thought, and that's that it's not just that the Bible talks about Jubilees, it's that every time it talks about one, it gives a connection to this timeline. That's significant. That means he wants us to connect those Jubilees to this timeline, because every time it talks about one, it connects it to this timeline. So God is trying to help us to see. He's not trying to, keep us in the dark. And yeah, that's right. I just wanted to say, too, that Jesus understood where he was. To me, it says the whole thing right there. Yeshua knew where he was in the world's history when he was on the earth. That's good enough for me. He did, and and you know what's interesting? He left early. In other words, the Day of Atonement was the actual declaration of the beginning of his ministry. And when he made that declaration in Nazareth was the official beginning, because you remember he said, he left the carpenter shop and he came to John and said, "Suffer it to be so now, for thus it becometh us to fulfill all righteousness." Then the Spirit drove him up into the wilderness. So we know that he understood his Bible, because he knew these things that he was going to go through needed to take some time before he began his public ministry. So, and then remember, he went from the wilderness, he came down and he went to Cana. And his mother wanted him to turn the water to wine, and what did he say to her? "My time's not yet come." But he went ahead and did it for his mother. But he was very clear to tell her that, my time has not yet come. So he knew when his time was. and so should we. That's the point. And so he understood the prophecies. He's our example in all things. And he knew when to pick up his work. And we also know from the scripture he knew when to lay it down. And if the 144,000 are following the Lamb whithersoever he goeth, then we too have the privilege of knowing where we are in this world's history. So that I'm really excited about tomorrow night, because the Jubilees, they give the rest of the information that's needed. So I guess we'll have to take questions. Oh, go ahead. You had a question. Oh, okay.
Oh, I just had a question. Can't you get rid of that 536 at the very end and just input the 2,300 days from Daniel 8:14? Because it says from the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to whenever shall be 2,300 days. It says until Messiah. Yeah, the cleansing of the sanctuary shall be 2,300 days, and we know that's 1844.
Right.
So can't you just put 2,300 days or years in there?
Well, I'll answer that question for you, and we're going to tomorrow night. Interesting you asked that, because tomorrow night that's exactly what one of the things we're going to do, is because that period of time is one of the periods that helps us to establish 457 is one of the is a point that helps us establish when the Lord made his declaration, and also when the 2,300 days ended. So it will be in the line. We are going to do that. Okay. Most of it was in the book. We added some details for people that like to study. I added a few details for people that like to study it a little closer, and we all should. They're free. They're back there on the table. So yeah, and if you want to take a few and give them away, then feel free to do that too, because time's getting short, and we believe, and we want to get them out. So thanks for asking. You're free to have one, and more than one if you want it. So, any other questions on what we presented tonight? I know it's getting time to quit here, but Mike had one, but I see he's not here right now. What? Oh yeah. Well, thank you. Well, then let's pray. Lord, thank you for your word that's a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. Thank you that you bought these figures with your own blood. They're not just figures. You paid a high price for them. And we just want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for everything that you have done for us, that you're doing for us now, and that you're getting ready to do for your people. Pray, Lord, that you would open our eyes, that we might see that the end of all things is at hand, that we would not resist it in our hearts, but that we would embrace it, and that you would be glorified. For you are going to do marvelous things in these last days. Pray that you would accelerate the process of purification in our lives. We are so needy. We come before you, and you said ask, and so we ask. You don't ask us to ask for things that you're not willing to give us. And so bless your people, I pray, and bless these studies as we continue on. And I pray that it will be clear, and I do believe it will get more clear as we go along. In Yeshua's name.